Welcome back to The Mentors. This is Sergey, and my co-host Vadim is at a wedding this week in Italy, so he's not joining us today, but you are listening to another edition of the 5-Minute Pick-Me-Up, the weekly series where we tell you short stories to motivate you for the week to come. And this week, I wanted to tell you the inside story of how Dennis Crowley started Foursquare. Many of you know the Foursquare location-based app. You've probably used it in the last several years as it became popular, actually starting in around 2009, and it's changed its forms in many ways. But we're actually going to go back in history about how that business started, and even before that, how the original idea for a location-based check-in app came about. So Dennis actually came to speak to our summer accelerator in New York this week, and so you're hearing an inside story that you're probably not going to be able to find anywhere online because it's part of this exclusive program that we have at New York University, which is actually Dennis's alma mater for his master's program. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what Dennis shared about the early founding stories of Foursquare and Dodgeball, the location-based app, because I think it's a really inspiring story. So back in about 1998 or 1999, right around the time that Dennis graduated from his undergraduate degree, he moved to New York City. He was in his early 20s, and he was figuring out what he was going to do next. He worked for this company that built applications for the Palm Pilot, which is like a early version of a smartphone that kind of barely worked the way he described it. And he was reading Harry Potter at the time, and there's this concept of a Marauders map, and he thought, wow, it would be so cool if you could have like a real-life Marauders map for New York City. And you have to remember, this is before everybody had smartphones. You know, it wasn't like everybody had Google Maps on their phones. It just didn't exist at the time. The idea of a map where you can see where your friends have been just really didn't exist at the time because the technology really just wasn't there. And so Dennis set out to wanting to create this idea, but at the time he had no one that was an engineer that could build it for him, and he couldn't afford to hire an engineer. And back in the late 90s, early 2000s, it was pretty expensive to build software like this. So he decided he would just learn how to code himself. He decided to pick up one of these books that taught you how to code in ASP in 30 days, and that was enough for him to build a rudimentary app. And once he built this simple app that let you essentially send a mass text message or an email to your friends telling them where you were, he started getting his friends to use it. And it was kind of a side project for a while until he got laid off in 2004 from that company that built apps for Palm Pilots after the dot-com bubble. And he had been working on it with his friends, and they decided, let's put some extra resources into it and actually build something that works a little bit better. And so they started getting users for this app that they spent time around the clock developing. And after a while, they started getting thousands of users. And they were trying to raise money for this crude app, but it was the early 2000s. It was after the dot-com bubble burst, and so they weren't really able to successfully raise money, but they still kept on going to conferences and talking about this new idea of location-based applications for mobile technologies. And one day when he was at a conference, there was this business development representative from Google that heard him talk, and they invited him to come to Google and to present to a small group of people about this location-based app Dodgeball that they built. And it turned out that they really liked their technology, but they didn't invest in startups. They were fundraising at the time. Dodgeball was trying to raise some money. They didn't invest, but they said, you know what? You can be part of Google. Maybe we'll just buy you. That'll be easier. And so they acquired him just a year after he started working on Dodgeball full-time. After that layoff, they acquired the company, and they had only about 30,000 users at that time. So kind of goes to show that, sometimes you might have to take the path that you didn't really expect to take your company to the next level. And I'm sure that acquisition gave him a little bit of money to play with and gave him some job security with jobs at Google. So it was actually a pretty good turnout. But a couple of years later, Google decided to shut down the project. They didn't really think that this idea of a location-based check-in app was that interesting, and they had turned it into their own kind of product, and so they shut it down. And that's when Dennis quit Google and decided, you know what, I'm going to build it again. So this is a guy that just has this passion for this one type of innovation and technology and decides over and over again to build it. And again, he knew that he had to build a simple app to get good developers to join him. So if you want to build something and you want to find a technical co-founder, we've talked about this on the show before, don't wait for somebody to just build something for you. Build it yourself, or maybe pay an engineer to build it for you, some small amount that you can outsource, and at least prove to people that there's demand, that it works. And that's exactly what Dennis did. And of course, by the time in 2009, GPS technology was completely different. Almost every single phone had GPS and location-based technology on the device, so building a location-based application was a completely different proposition. It was much more possible, and it was much easier to propagate it to people. And once they built this tool called Foursquare, again, you can see playground game motif repeating here, Dodgeball, Foursquare, they started getting a ton of people signing up to this tool. And they ended up getting millions of people to sign up to use this location-based tool to check in, essentially, back in the 2009, 2010, but it stalled out. And there was these apps that were growing like wildfire, like Facebook and like some of the other social networking apps, and they were surpassing 50 million users, 100 million users. And so if you're an app that had in the tens of millions of users, you were no longer seen as something huge that could continue to raise venture capital. So they had to figure out another model really quickly. And they had all these companies using their location-based data, such as Flickr, which was a photo sharing app at the time. You know, they were using it for free. They were giving it to them for free so that they could get people using their app, so they could get more users and more data and improve the service. And at one point, one of the investors and one of the board members of Foursquare came to Dennis. His name was Ben Horowitz. He's a co-founder with Andreessen Horowitz, the famous venture capital fund. Ben told him, listen, you are giving this location-based tool for free to all of these tech companies. You got to charge them. And Dennis at the time thought, well, why would they pay us when they can just switch to Google and Google will offer it to them for free? And Ben's idea was that it would be too painful for them to switch. They rely on your service. They like using it. They like the accessibility that you give them. So just try it. And so they decided to try. And Flickr was like, yeah, you know, we were wondering when you were going to ask us to pay for this because it's such a useful tool. And they went to Instagram, which was one of their early users that had, again, millions and millions of users using this location-based technology. And they also agreed to pay. And so it went from a B2C company, just being a consumer tool, to then a B2B business where they were actually generating revenue from enterprises who wanted to use this location-based tool, which completely changed the company and put them on a new trajectory and actually gave them a business model. And Dennis was very mature at the time to realize that he was a guy that liked to build apps and build technology. He wasn't a guy to go after large enterprise contracts, so he hired a CEO. He essentially replaced himself as CEO of that company to hire somebody who knew how to sell into enterprises, and he retained a position as executive chairman of Foursquare. And he's still at Foursquare to this day, 10 years later, running the company, and they're on their way. They think that within the next couple of years, they could be ready to IPO. So this is an incredible story of this guy who, you know, had this insight, this idea that I want to let people see where their friends are on this map, check in, and have it be a way to basically get people to certain locations. He just thought it was so cool that by having a piece of technology in your hands that showed people where other people checked in, where they were, you could actually drive traffic to a particular location, and in the real world, people would meet and know where their friends are. And he took this idea through many iterations and built it himself early on when he had to, essentially, and pivoted when he had to get this technology to as many people as possible. So hopefully this is a lesson to us all that if we have a dream to see something in this world, we can't wait around for somebody else to build it. We have to figure out how to do it ourselves, and sometimes you have to, you know, make difficult decisions in the course of a company to realize your vision for what it's going to be. But ultimately, he was able to generate hundreds and thousands of jobs for people and grow this technology company into the brand that we all know and love today. That's it for our 5-minute pick-me-up for this week. Thanks for tuning in today, and we'll see you on Wednesday.